how much we can really have an enjoyment in this type of conversation. But my assignment is to give some context to the argument that you see amongst the synod in this. And so what originally transpired is that Samuel B. Howe posed this question when the application was rejected. And the question that he posed was, is slavery a sin? And so what Samuel Howe did was he used scripture to support the fact that while slavery was evil, it was not necessarily a sin. So he used Old Testament scriptures as well as New Testament scriptures to justify the fact that slavery was accepted biblically. And then he turns around and he says that Christ, as well as the apostles, had ample opportunity to dispel that notion, but they opted not to. And this is where he set the parameters as to, which we discussed earlier today. He set the parameters that there is a responsibility that slave owners have in terms of treatment toward their slaves. However, there is still not anything that says slavery is a sin. And so it is Van Dyke who comes along and he responds to what Samuel Howe was saying by contradicting everything that he says in terms of what scripture says, and dispelling the notion about what slavery represents and what it isn't. And he takes the position that slavery being evil is injustice. And so there are some things that I thought were very important that became questions for me, and I wanted to do further research on it. And so in addition to the fact that the question that was presented by Howe himself, is slavery a sin? Two questions that came to my mind immediately was, well, when did slavery become about race? I thought that was a very important question to me. And why did the church take so long to theologically address slavery and put into its proper context? And so that's where my research had taken me, because I wanted to find those answers out for myself. And I think sometimes when we start off, and this is what Van Dyke says, who's actually from New Brunswick, he says that there's a misnomer about slavery, because slavery and indentured servanthood were used interchangeably at the time. And so biblically speaking, indentured servanthood is actually when someone voluntarily presents themselves for provision for their families, and biblically there is a release for them after an extended period of time. And so if we're going to look at scripture, then there are three principal scriptures that can be found in Exodus that I think is very important. The Mosaic laws protected if servants were hurt, slaveholders had to release them. Individuals could not be kidnapped and sold into slavery without the penalty of death. And then finally, if a slave did manage to escape, they could not be returned back to the slave owners. And so that's a biblical principle found in Exodus and Deuteronomy as well. And so when we want to use this as the basis culturally, it becomes problematic. And so how did it become about race? There is a Spanish Christian priest, which is why I believe that this, the church's response has been a non-response, because it was a Christian priest that introduced African Americans as slaves, or viable options for slaves. And so that would be Bartholomew de Casas, is the one that had a passion for the Indians, because there was a period of time when slaves were being transferred from Spain into America, that they were trying to utilize Indians, and they were sickly and they were not surviving the trip. And so Costas actually had an experience where he saw many Indians that were slaughtered, and it vexed him in his spirit. And because he felt like Africans did not have a soul, and it was not necessary for him to have a conscience about them being worked to death. And so he suggested that we begin to utilize Africans, and that's how the African slave trade was originally originated. And because we did have the strength and the resilience, which is consistent with what Dr. Madden said, about black people having strength and resolve, and them being capable of making it over really is what introduced slavery in America. Unfortunately, we find ourselves still in this position where the church is visibly silent, because who could really say anything if it originated in the church for African Americans? And so it was not until in the 1600s, I believe it was like around 1655, where the Quakers were one of the first to make a written position. They filed a petition to really discuss the fact that slavery was a sin and that it was wrong. They were rejected in that. You don't hear anything else until you have this petition, for North Carolina to be received out of the German Reformed Church into the Dutch Church. And that's what leads to the conversation of 1855. So what you have read was the challenge of not answering the question that Howe asked, which his question was still, is slavery a sin? They never answered that question. What they were trying to do is figure out the language that would best reflect and represent the church. And so their argument was never about the moral responsibility or the right and the wrong of it, but when you look at the argument that they were saying, they were saying, how can we present this without taking a stand? So if you read it, that's the arguments that I see going back and forth. How can we say, we want to maintain peace in the church. We don't want to disrupt the status quo, but we've got to say something about being inclusive of everyone and not judging them. I found it very interesting that there was a general consensus on both sides that slavery was evil. And so that wasn't being disputed. But when was the church going to take a position that slavery was a sin? It was very difficult for them to do that. And so what you see is the wrestling back and forth in that conversation in the Senate. After Van Wyck responded to Howe, they never really responded to the original question that Howe asked, which I think was a legitimate question. Is slavery a sin? And what they did was they said, how can we just give our presentation and say, we want to accept you in, but we don't want to accept you as slaveholders. And I think that that's where they ultimately decided we're going to have to reject the application. But that was the wrestling, because if you look in what you're seeing, it was all about the language that really was like, how do we say, we don't believe in this practice, but we want to include you in. And ultimately, it was dismissed altogether. And it was the first real conversation that the Dutch Reformed Church had about slavery and its morality. Any questions?
Yeah. Well, it just seems that in reading